Hi, I'm Nancy Gross. I'm a folklorist here at the American Folklife Center. I want to welcome you back to the afternoon session of Women Documenting the World. Thank you all for coming. Just one piece of housekeeping. If these glasses belong to anybody?
Oh, those are mine.
Okay. We're very efficient here at the Library of Congress. Thank Liz for turning them in. So we're going to have a very exciting afternoon. We're going to have speakers. We're going to highlight another part of our collection. We're going to have a panel featuring contemporary collectors. We did the historic panel this morning. We'll do the contemporary collectors. And then we've also left some time at the very end of the day, just half an hour, because this is very much a work in progress. We're thinking probably 18 to 22 months of programming here at the American Folklife Center on women collections, women-generated collections, and women collectors. And it could take a number of different aspects, including ethics or opportunities and challenges of fieldwork. We can go a number of different directions, but we'd like to get some feedback from you as people are particularly interested in the topic and how we position ourselves as we go forward doing programming. So, yes?
How can we find out about future programs? Will you have a special website?
We do the our basic website, which is at the Library of Congress, loc.gov/folklife. You should be on. You should, if you don't know about that yet, you should go visit that, and also put your name on the RSS feed, so that we can send you announcements, and on our Facebook site, and also sign up for Folklife Today, which is our blog, all of which details what we do. So that's a good question. Thank you for letting us know. And we haven't fully finished programming next year, and we actually have to wait till we get a federal budget to do so. But we have great hopes that this will be not a problem. So what I'd like to do is start off. We're going to start off with a short presentation by Meredith Holmgren, who's with the Smithsonian. And Meredith serves as curator of American women's music at the Smithsonian, and has interests including intangible cultural heritage, ethnomusicology, anthropology, Asian studies, American studies, feminism, and cultural policy. Before being in her current role, she worked as a program manager for education at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, and also for Smithsonian Folkways recordings. She has an extensive background in a wide variety of topics, but she's basically an ethnomusicologist. She has an MA in cultural anthropology and also in Asian studies. She did a lot of work at the University of Leiden in Germany. And we thought it'd be interesting because often ideas sort of take root in a number of places at the same time. And just as we're becoming more interested and aware of our women collections here, the Smithsonian has also started to do more with women-generated collections and collectors. So I'd like to invite Meredith up now to tell us a little bit about what's going on at our sister organization.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Thanks to all the organizers here at the Library of Congress for putting this symposium together. Can you all hear me okay? I can't tell. Okay. So it's really just such a pleasure to be here today speaking with you about my work as a curator of American women's music at the Smithsonian Institution. And this is a position that I've occupied for only the last 6 months or so. So it's relatively new. I began in March of this year after serving Folkways recordings for a little over 6 years, also at the Smithsonian as the program manager and education specialist, as Nancy mentioned. My position now is part of a larger Smithsonian-wide initiative called the American Women's History Initiative. As many people probably know, 2019 to 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting many, though importantly not all, women the right to vote in the United States. And it's anniversaries like this that tend to prompt a lot of institutional reflection about where we've been as an institution, where we're going, how can we improve our practices, specifically in this case related to gender. And thus the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative was born not only out of anticipation of the anniversary, but also a desire to be a little more intentional about the way that the National Museum approaches gender and women's history in its work. This encompasses not only women's history in our collections and programming, but also internally in our employment practices, equity and diversity in a range of roles and responsibilities. So I am one of at least 9 new curatorial hires who will be focusing on women's history at the Smithsonian. We're being seated in different units throughout the institution during the next few years. And although my specialty is in music and recorded sound, with this position, I have an opportunity to work across the institution to explore different types of music collections, particularly instruments and visual arts, sheet music, archival documents, and recordings through the lens of women's history. And the main project that I'm working on now is conducting research in anticipation of an exhibition that we hope to open up near the end of 2020, maybe early 2021, about women's music history. And this will be in the Smithsonian Library space at the National Museum of American History. The exhibition is going to examine the rich and diverse contributions that women have made to music history, primarily as performers, researchers, recording artists, and documentarians, though not exclusively. And the working title is Music Herstory: Stories of Women in Music in Smithsonian Collections. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I was told that this symposium will be a chance to talk about ongoing research that's really like in process and isn't totally finished and polished yet. So bear with me as I tell you a bit about a summary of some of the work that I've been doing the last 6 months. But it will be ongoing for the next few years. So as curator of the world's largest museum complex for music, we have about 16,000 musical instruments, over 100,000 pages of sheet music, a living record label, and approximately 400 or more music-related programs per year. So where does one even begin when planning an exhibition about American women's music history? And I decided to start with nursery rhymes. Why not, right? Nursery rhymes and lullabies are one of the oldest, earliest, or most universal forms of women-centered musical transmission that I've come across in our collections. Nowadays, nursery rhymes and lullabies are, of course, sung by people of all genders. But from what I've found, for most of recorded history, these have been viewed primarily as a specialty of women, mothers, and caretakers in particular. Mother Goose is, of course, one of the most iconic sources of nursery rhymes. Starting in the late 1600s, collections of Mother Goose material began to be published in European literary markets, and nearly 100 years later, they would start to appear in the United States. Sometime in the 18th or 19th century, nursery rhymes began to be printed for mass distribution, and the oldest collections of nursery rhymes that I've come across thus far at the Smithsonian do date from about that period. And I just think they are a fascinating window, an area of women's music history, not just because of the fantasy and imagination that they tend to conjure in listeners, but also because they play an important role in passing along information between generations. Some nursery rhymes have satirized political events or political figures, where others are created maybe for pure entertainment, but still others convey warnings about issues like safety or gender expectations or social behavior. One of these, for example, is My Lady Wind. It was derived from a Mother Goose book published in the mid-1800s that can be found in the special collections of the Dibner Library, the American History Museum. It's a nursery rhyme that warns about the dangers of nosy people and vicious gossip. The behavior it conveys can bring about misfortune to both the subject of the gossip and the gossiper alike. Although Mother Goose is a historical figure, is often portrayed as an anonymous conglomeration by English-speaking forebearers, it's precisely this notion of intergenerational collective documentation that I think makes it so interesting through the lens of women's history. Another note of the Music Herstory exhibition will be about women composers. One such person who I plan to spotlight is Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. She was known as the last ruling monarch in the independent kingdom of Hawaii. She was also a gifted musician and composer, penning at least 165 songs and chants during her lifetime, many of which are still performed and popular today in Hawaii. She was also forced, as many of you know, to abdicate in 1895. She was placed under house arrest, and during this time, she not only composed a lot of original material, but she also compiled a number of traditional songs that she wanted to be documented for future generations. She also documented her struggles under house arrest in other ways, such as through quilting and a number of allegorical newspaper columns, which were published in a local Hawaiian language publication. Among her many compositions is Aloha Oi, which many of you probably recognize. It's arguably Hawaii's most popular song. It was initially composed in 1878, and it is about two lovers who bid each other a reluctant, nostalgic farewell. In addition to sheet music and recordings, the Smithsonian has a rare book written by Liliuokalani in the Smithsonian libraries, and it's simply titled Hawaii's Story. It was published in 1898. She documents the history of Hawaiian Islands and includes a few passages dedicated to music, wherein she details the process of composing Hawaii's third national anthem in coordination with King Kamehameha in the mid-19th century. This book is a rare original copy signed by the Queen herself, and it's believed to have been brought to DC during one of the Queen's tireless advocacy trips, where she would lobby the US government lawmakers to restore the monarchy in Hawaii. These efforts, of course, proved unsuccessful, however, and after Liliuokalani's passing in 1917, Aloha Oi became widely interpreted as a lament for the overthrown indigenous kingdom. Through much of the 20th century, women have been rewarded as musicians, popularly, primarily when they sing or perform as musical acts. It's even today relatively rare for women to be recognized in the mainstream for their contributions as instrumentalists, and even rarer for them to be recognized for playing in bands alongside other women instrumentalists. There are some notable exceptions to this, of course, but in general, this is a mainstream trend, and there is a lot of emerging research on this. Most recently, there was a really great study I encourage you all to check out from the University of Southern California that looks at pop music and the gender dynamics therein. Within music instrument classification, some instruments are typically viewed as more like female-friendly than others. The brass section in orchestras or jazz bands, for example, are famously male-dominated. A notable exception to this, which I'll highlight in the exhibition, was during World War II, when many of the male jazz artists were serving overseas, thus leaving an opportunity for women to shine their talents here at home. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm graced the national stage as the first racially integrated all-female jazz band operating from approximately 1937 to 1946. In 2011, alto saxophone player Roslyn "Roz" Cron donated a collection to the Smithsonian of photographs, correspondence, news clippings, and ephemera from her time as an international sweetheart. Other donations followed shortly thereafter, enriching the collection to where it is today. The Sweethearts of Rhythm began as a fundraising effort for Piney Woods Country Life School, which was a boarding school for indigent, orphaned African American children in Mississippi. They became so popular that they ended up leaving the school in 1941 to become a professional touring band, ultimately settling in Arlington, Virginia. Their members were comprised of different racial and ethnic groups, ranging from Latinas and Asians to Caucasians, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans. This diversity was said to give the group a, quote, international flavor, and so international was affixed to their name, and they became the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. When it came to the music, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm reigned supreme, attracting some of the strongest female talent of their era. One of the standout performers was trumpeter Ernestine Carroll, better known as Tiny Davis, who was affectionately referred to as the female Louis Armstrong. And in fact, Louis Armstrong himself was a big fan of hers, and the media and musicians described her as the heart of the band. The Smithsonian collection of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm documents the band's touring history, overseas military performances, correspondence, media press reception, and more. And it's because of Ms. Cron's dedication to both performance and documentation that we were able to research and exhibit these materials to audiences today at the National Museum. After focusing on composers, performers, nursery rhymes, and sheet music, the final section of the exhibition that I'll highlight today will be highlighting more conventionally recognized women researchers, as well as Smithsonian staff who have worked to make music come alive at the National Museum. Frances Densmore, who lived from approximately 1867 to 1957, is among the most well-recognized of the Smithsonian's music documentarians. She trained at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. She went on to be a prolific researcher who specialized in documentation of indigenous North American music at a time when the languages, traditions, and ways of life for indigenous people were being actively suppressed by the US government. Through meticulous transcription, sound recordings, and countless publications, Densmore created a prolific body of work, some of which does remain in use for researchers today. And if nothing else, you probably recognize that photograph. It's an iconic photograph taken in front of the Smithsonian Castle in the early 20th century. It is staged, and it is a performative photo with Mountain Chief of the Blackfoot tribe. So rather than an accurate portrayal of fieldwork, it is staged, but nonetheless became a popular image of what fieldwork was imagined to be like in the early 20th century. Another researcher who I'm interested in highlighting as a documentarian is Joanna Colcord. She lived from 1882 to 1960. She was an early researcher of sea shanties. She was born aboard a boat to seafaring parents and went on to document the work, language, and cultural expressions of American sailors and seamen. Her research was published in several books and continues to influence our interpretation of maritime music today at the Smithsonian. Some of her work was used in our classic maritime compilation published by Smithsonian Folkways. So, as we can see from some of the examples I just discussed, women documentarians present in Smithsonian collections often occupy multiple roles simultaneously. Documentation and caretaker, as perhaps represented by Mother Goose, documentarian, composer, and political figure, as with Queen Liliuokalani, documentarian and musician, as the case with Roz Cron of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, and as researchers, documentarians, and even museum employees, as represented by figures like Frances Densmore, Joanna Colcord, and others. So ultimately, it's a great honor to have the privilege of elevating women's work at the National Museum. And, my general approach, I want to look at intersectionality, embodiment, perseverance, and I want to stimulate intergenerational conversations in the years to come. And I want people to come away learning things about our collections and also feeling like they too are contributors to our national story of music. So I look forward to continuing the work, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks. Okay. Yep. Otherwise, we'll just move it along. Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, I want to just briefly introduce the moderator of the next panel, Lisa Gilman, who's a faculty member in folklore studies and public humanities at George Mason University. And her research interests include performance, music, dance, intangible cultural heritage, trauma, gender, and sexuality in Southern Africa and in the United States. And I also want to note that she's just put out, co-authored with John Fenn on our staff, a wonderful book on folklore and ethnomusicology, Fieldwork Methods Handbook, which is a terrific new publications. Congratulations to both of you. And because for all those reasons, we couldn't think of a better person to be the moderator of the next panel. So, Lisa.
Thank you, Nancy. I brought a copy, if anybody. Mostly because this is a symposium on fieldwork, and we haven't had a fieldwork textbook come out in a while, a really long while. The ones that we were, well, the ones that we were basically using as the predecessors were talking about cassettes, and we thought maybe it was time to talk about something different. Anyway, so yeah, with this new handbook, it is we did write it with a broad range of audiences in mind. So both people working in academic settings, public settings, people trying to do workshops, people teaching whole classes, kind of a wide range of different things. So hopefully some of you will find it a useful resource. So thank you, Nancy, for organizing this. This is a great event. I'm enjoying myself so much, and it's fun to have the opportunity to introduce our panelists in our next panel. So this panel is contemporary documentation, and we have two people, Candace Taylor and Anne Rasmussen. So each speaker will have 30 minutes, and then afterwards we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So we'll have lots of time. So we'll start with Candace Taylor. She is an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian. She has her own, I don't know, company or what you call, called Tailor Made Culture, and you should go to her website. It's amazing. She has done many compelling projects that have required extensive fieldwork across the U.S. All of her work dispels common stereotypes about relationships between gender, ethnicity, and race. Her book, Counterculture, is about professional diner waitresses. American Roots examines how hair of people of all different identities intersects with culture and identity. By the Horns is about female bull riders and bullfighters. And today she will present, I think, on her most current project, the Green Book Project. And I think some of you might have seen she's gotten some visibility given that a movie by the same title, I'm assuming you'll talk a little bit about that. But she's been doing the on-the-ground research that documents properties from a historical travel guide during the Jim Crow era that listed businesses where Black people could safely go to. The project has gotten a lot of attention and has been awarded fellowships from Harvard through the Henry Louis Gates Fellowship, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Graham Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the California Humanities, and the American Folklife Center. So with that, Candace Taylor will talk about the Green Book Project.
There we are. All right. So everyone can hear me. Thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you for this day. I was so excited to be here because it's such an incredibly interesting topic, and Nancy Gross has been so wonderful and just a longtime supporter, and the American Folklife Center in general has just supported my work for many years, and I am eternally grateful. It's such a prestigious award. It really is a highlight of my career, being an Archie Green Fellow. So thank you. Let me just angle this so I'm not turning away every time. Here we go. Okay, over the last 20 years, I have traveled nearly 500,000 miles, and that's what I've figured out throughout America, documenting everything from female bullfighters to aging diner waitresses to hairstylists who serve ethnicities including African American, Pakistani, Jamaican, Japanese, Orthodox Jewish communities. And I received an Archie Green Fellowship for the American Roots Project. So that is archived, and people can listen to those interviews. My current project is the Green Book. And again, I did receive an Archie Green Fellowship for that, and that is what I'm going to focus on today. And the Green Book, for those of you who don't know, but of course there was a big film out that really didn't have anything to do with the Green Book. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and I've been doing this work since 2013. I started documenting the buildings and stories surrounding the Green Book, but it was a travel guide that was published for Black people during the Jim Crow era. And it was created by a man named Victor Green, and he was a postal worker from Harlem. And legend has it that he modeled his guide after the Jewish traveler guides that were used in the Borscht Belt in the 1930s. And the Green Book was like a AAA guide for Black people. That's how it was described, but it was really so much more because it listed more than just the general, food and lodging. There were gas stations and department stores and tailors and nightclubs and drugstores and haberdashers and sanitariums, and there were banks, funeral homes, and real estate offices. It was really just evident how many places in America and society that Black people were shut out of. So it was really necessary to have all of these places included. There was even a dude ranch that was listed in the Green Book, and it was outside of Victorville, California. It was a 40-acre ranch, and Pearl Bailey bought it in the 1960s. It has incredible history, so that was fun. And there's tourist homes, which we think may have been some of the first Airbnbs, mostly run by widows, women who opened up their homes if they had an extra bedroom and they'd cook a meal. It was a place, the Green Book was widely used during the second wave of the Great Migration. So there were a lot of Black people not just taking vacations, but also fleeing the South. So it really covered all classes. Black people who didn't have money may stay at a tourist home for a lot, for more affordable lodging. I stumbled onto the Green Book by accident. I was commissioned to write a travel guide on Route 66, and I did it because I needed the money. And as soon as I took the job, I thought, why am I doing this? And it was odd because over 95% of all the people who had written about Route 66 were white males. And so I kept reading all of these guides thinking, there's got to be this other layer to this. It was just the amount of nostalgia was just kind of overwhelming. As a Black female cultural documentarian, I just thought, well, where were the Black people and what did they do? And once I started asking that question, because I knew I wanted to write a different kind of a travel guide, then I stumbled onto the Green Book, which was, again, by accident, and it was also a clear light of like, oh, this is why I'm in this hell writing this travel guide, was because this was the real project, and so it was a gift. And I was at the Autry Museum when I saw my first Green Book. It was in Los Angeles, and I never knew such a thing had existed. It was about 2013, and I ran out of the museum as soon as I saw it, and I called my parents, and I said, oh my God, do you know about this? Like, what is this? And my mother had never heard of it. My stepfather, who grew up in the South, he knew what it was. And so I while I was researching, I kept reading about these Black men who had these nicer cars, and they would pretend to be a chauffeur. So they would, not get harassed by the police. And I asked my stepfather, Ron, I said, you read stuff, and you're like, is this real? Do you know anything about this? And he told me the story, and he said, yes, it happened to him when he was 7 years old. And that's Ron, my stepfather. And his father had a good job with the railroad. And Ron was, like I said, about 7 years old. They had their 1953 new Chevy. It was complete with all the, bells and whistles. And they were going on vacation, and they were heading north from Tennessee, and they got pulled over by a sheriff. And his parents were in the front seat of the car, and Ron was sitting in the back seat. And when they got pulled over, Ron's father turned to him and looked to him in the back seat and said, "Don't say a word," as the sheriff was walking up to the car. And Ron had never heard his father speak to him in that kind of serious tone, and he didn't understand what was happening. And so when the sheriff comes to the side of the window, and says, well, where'd you get this car? And, who are these people with you? And what are you doing here? And, Ron's father said, it's my employer's car. And he pointed to his wife and pretended not to know her and said, this is the maid, and this is her son in the back, and I'm taking them home. And so the sheriff said, well, where's your hat? And Ron's father said, it's hanging up in the back, officer. And the sheriff waved him off and said, all right, move on. But that black chauffeur's hat had been hanging in the back seat as long as Ron could remember. He said he just had always seen this hat, and he didn't know why. And after that day, he said he saw him in every black man's car he rode in. And he said he always kept it in the car, and everybody had one. And the Green Book was published during a time when car travel symbolized freedom in America, and yet racial segregation was in full force throughout the country, and there were thousands of sundown towns that were largely a northern and western phenomena, So this wasn't so much so in the Deep South. There were about 13 sundown towns, say, in Mississippi, but there were close to 400 in Illinois. So just to give you a snapshot of what this was. And a sundown town was a place where black people were banned from entering or being in city limits after dark. Black folks couldn't eat, sleep, or buy gasoline in many white-owned businesses. Coca-Cola vending machines had white customers only printed on them. And to avoid the humiliation of being denied basic services, a lot of black people just traveled with ice coolers, with full gas cans. And yet, they still traveled. They still did it. Black people still got in their cars, and they threw caution to the wind, and they still took vacations like every other American. And, when I first learned about the Green Book, I was struck that something so simple and so practical could just be so powerful. It was such a simple solution to a horrific problem. And one of the reasons why the Green Book was so successful was that Esso gas stations, which is ExxonMobil today, they were a major distributor of the Green Book, and you could buy one in their gas stations. And not only did they sell the Green Book, they assigned 2 black marketing executives here who are featured in the Green Book, and they helped promote and distribute the guide. By 1962, the Green Book had a circulation of nearly 2 million viewers or readers. And the Green Book listing spanned throughout the United States. Later editions went as far as the Virgin Islands and Europe and Bermuda and Africa. And I've cataloged, nearly 10,000 Green Book businesses. Most of them were owned by black people. And it is, again, a powerful record of black entrepreneurship. So that was another layer of the project that, once I got to dig in a little deeper, I realized it's not just a list of names, that there are businesses behind these names and histories and people who ran these businesses. And once I started mapping Green Book sites, it became evident that they weren't just randomly scattered across the country. They were clustered in these traditional black neighborhoods like Harlem and south side of Chicago. And for this project in particular, I estimated I've driven about 40,000 miles on America's 2-lane highways. As much as possible, I use the avoid highways option on my Google map. I rarely ever drive on freeways. And I will take an extra couple of hours to go on the 2-lane road rather than get on the freeway. I just don't see the point. You don't see anything on the freeway. And, there's usually traffic or just stuff that I don't care about. So I avoid the freeways. But by doing this, I got to see beautiful deserts. I was on dirt roads and mountains. And it was really, really a gift to take these trips. And some of the Green Book sites, this is a Green Book site, was just on, in nicer middle class neighborhoods. But I also drove through miles and miles and miles of blight and boarded up buildings in Baltimore and Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and Philadelphia. And I witnessed poverty that most Americans have never seen. When I was driving my first trip from LA to New York City, by the time I got to Detroit, I was in tears because I just couldn't imagine. I mean, the amount of just buildings that had been on fire, that trees were growing inside of them and they'd been abandoned. And these were in neighborhoods where somebody right next door is just sitting on their porch like it's just a regular day. Most of these, even just, I'll show you this last one. Yeah, I mean, this place looks condemned but it's open, actually. Wonderland Bar, it was a Green Book site. And that man had just come out of there and the neon light is still on. I mean, it's still operating. And that's in Baltimore. And, while I was out on the road conducting this field research, I would speak to Ron, my stepfather. And, he asked me to text him every day. He was worried for my safety. And, I've been doing this work for a while and I'm not a fragile flower. And, it's like I know how to take care of myself and I follow my instincts. And but this was a different situation because he knew the neighborhoods that I was in. And, I'd been verbally attacked and chased and lunged at by, all kinds of people, mentally ill people, chased by dogs. And so Ron, had every reason to be concerned. He was an old school Southern man too. And, I used to roll my eyes when he would be like, why are you out there alone? But I got it. And I did want somebody to know at the end of the day that I had made it to my destination. Because I was on these 2-lane roads in the middle of nowhere. Even if I'd had car trouble, somebody needed to kind of check in and make sure I'd made it. But Ron, he gave me a stun gun, a knife, and mace, and taught me how to use them. He was in law enforcement, so he knew, how to teach me how to use these materials. And I had to be very careful because, if I was on the south side of Chicago, one weekend when 53 people were shot that weekend in the neighborhood that I was scouting, and there were just helicopters. I mean, it was incredible to me that, and ironic, really, thinking that, I'm too nervous to get out of my car in some of these neighborhoods, like if I was in Miami or in Detroit, and I'm doing research on a travel guide that was for safety, and these were safe zones for Black folks to be in, and I'm too nervous to get out of my car, or I'm asking myself, what do I bring with me? What if the car isn't here when I get back? Those kinds of questions that I had to ask myself, and it was a very surreal experience because when I think about Victor Green, the man who created the Green Book, and the introduction that he wrote would just ring through my head, and I'll read a quote here, because he prints this in many editions of the Green Book, and he says, "There will be a day, sometime in the near future, when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment. But until that time comes, we shall continue to publish this information for your convenience each year." And unfortunately, Victor Green died in 1960, so he never lived to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And although we want to believe the passage of the Civil Rights Act fixed racism, we know that didn't happen. And after segregation was deemed illegal, racism continued to shape America's social, political, and physical spaces. Black folks were blocked from the GI Bill, and Federal Housing Association continued to deny loans to blacks, preventing them from accessing wealth-building opportunities that were freely given to white people. And harmful policing policies like law and order and stop and frisk have led to the incarceration of nearly 1 in 3 young black men in America. And during the research for my project, I learned so much about America by just getting off the interstates and driving through these neighborhoods. And it was a great opportunity for me to see what America really is and not what it imagines itself to be or what we are aspiring to be. It was during these trips that I realized that if I wanted to understand what the Green Book meant in its historical context, I shouldn't just relegate it to something that happened back, that was a history guide, that it was this travel guide that was, this historic time capsule. I was interested in presenting the Green Book and showing this context of our country's ongoing struggle with race and social mobility, because the problems black people are facing today are just as brutal and debilitating and deadly as the problems that they faced when the Green Book was a tool that they used. So I've taken about 7 trips for this project. I've traveled about 4,000 miles. I've traveled to over 4,000 Green Book sites. Like I said, I cataloged about 10,000, and I've been to about 4,000. There's still lots of work to do. And I received a fellowship from Harvard at the Hutchins Center with Skip Gates. And so I've moved so many times in the last, since 2010, I've moved 8 times. But I started this project in 2013, so since then I've moved about 4 times. And I lived in Boston for the Harvard Fellowship, and then I moved to New York City because I got a fellowship at the Schomburg. There's over 400 Green Book sites in Harlem. So I moved back to Harlem, and that's where I'm settled now, and I'm not moving for a while. And I love New York, and so it's like I just want to be there. But each trip lasted anywhere from 3 weeks to the longest trip was about 5 months on the road. And there was one year I think I was only home for about 2 months out of the year. So it's been a journey, and it's been a huge commitment in terms of I'm not married, I don't have kids. And by design. I mean, I know it would not be fair because this is what I love to do and this is what I want to do. And I can't, I have succulents. Like, I can't even have plants that need me. Like, nothing can need me because I would not, I feel too guilty. So it's been quite a, it's a lifestyle, it's a life choice, and it's, one that I don't regret. So these are just my... Yeah, so, and when I was on the road, I ran a pretty tight ship. I worked about 16-hour days, and I got to a point where I could scout about 30 sites a day. Sometimes they're so clustered, they're so close together, it'd be a lot easier. Other times I'd drive all day and not see one. But I've estimated that about 75% of these sites are gone, and less than 3% are actually still operating. And on the rare occasion when I would find one, I'd just drive forever. It would just, this is a Rasmussen in Denver, and it would just tower over the sidewalk like this, like this beautiful force of nature. And sometimes I'd want to get out of my car and jump up, and sometimes I did. I just jumped up and down. I was like, I can't contain myself in the car. I can't believe it's here. I can't believe I see the sign. And, these businesses survived redlining, urban renewal, and gentrification now, which is a big threat to a lot of businesses that have managed to last this long. In terms of this Archie Green Fellowship, I was able to not just deal with these buildings and photograph them, but to capture the stories of the people who are working and family members who have kept these businesses alive. This was Don Loper. His father ran Loper's Tire Service, which is listed in the Green Book, in 1959. This is David Sweat. His family has run Sweat's Fine Food in Nashville since the 1950s. This is Henri Treadwell. That she was interesting. Her aunt, Majeska Simpkins, is a fierce civil rights leader, and she started so many NAACP chapters throughout the state of South Carolina. There was actually a day dedicated to her in South Carolina, but she made real change for black folks in that state. And this was her niece, Henri Treadwell, telling her story. I got to interview Nelson Malden. He was Martin Luther King's barber. And he did Martin Luther King's hair on the first floor of the Hotel Ben Moore, which was a Green Book site in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is a site where King strategized the Montgomery bus boycott. Malden tells stories about knowing King and, what was happening inside that barbershop the first day of the bus boycott. They were all peeled at the window, seeing if the guy who always gets on the bus that morning was going to get on the bus that day. And so there were these real, incredibly, civil rights history moments and stories that I got to capture as well. So that was nice. And then I got to interview the legendary Leah Chase just about a month or two before she passed. She was 96 when I interviewed her. I met her before but didn't get to sit down and do an interview. So this time I got to sit down and do an interview at Dookie Chase's restaurant in New Orleans. And she, this restaurant hosted, if you don't know, it's an incredible place. They've hosted civil rights leaders like Thurgood Marshall, and SNCC used to be there. She's hosted, Michael Jackson loved her sweet potato pie, and she slapped Barack Obama's hand when he put hot sauce on her gumbo. And she tells that story in the interview, which is really, she's an incredible woman, and it was an incredible honor to interview her. And I cried 3 times during the interview. It was just really moving. And she even has a statement about being a woman, what it meant for me to be there as a woman and how important that was to her, for her to witness. I had a filmmaker there who we also captured this on video for the archive. And so I had a woman who was a camera woman, and it was me as a photographer and the documentarian, and Leah Chase just really was overwhelmed that there were these women coming to tell her story. So that was also very powerful for me. Enid Pinckney, she, another thing that came up as a theme in these interviews was preserving these buildings. And she has spearheaded like a $10 million project to renovate the Hampton House, which was a Green Book site. And it's restored to its beauty. It's in Miami. It's really incredible. And she was, I think, she was about 80, 78 or 80 when she started that project. So, it's just really inspiring to see these women, making sure that we keep this history. It was also, the Hampton House was the place where Martin Luther King practiced his I Have a Dream speech. Malcolm X proselytized Cassius Clay. He walked in as Cassius Clay and he left as Muhammad Ali. And that's in the Hampton House. And I mean, it's amazing. This place was gone. There were trees growing inside of it. There were squatters. And it had been just left neglected for decades. And there's other Green Book sites like this that hold this history that are just falling apart. So thankfully, thanks to Enid, you can go there, and it's an incredible building. Herbert Riley Suleiman, he was also another one. This is Charlie's place. Little Richard and all these greats played there. Unfortunately, he recently passed about a couple of months ago, and we started to become friends, and I really miss him. But he was in the middle of doing an incredible initiative to raise money to bring Charlie's place back. And, he did capture the attention of city officials, and they've put in, I think, close to $1 million in renovating. So I don't know what ultimately will happen with it, but keep an eye out for that, because it's another piece of history that that we're losing. I also interviewed Kenneth Jackson. He was at the Dewdrop in New Orleans, and his grandfather ran this nightclub. It has lots of funny stories about the different characters who performed there, and so the interviews are really telling. And then there's the Hotel Ben Moore. I'm in the beginning stages. This is where King, when Nelson Malden worked, and he were the barber who did Martin Luther King's hair. And I'm in the beginning stages of trying to spearhead my own preservation project at the Ben Moore. I interviewed the owner of the building, and he's, I'm speaking with the National Trust about preservation efforts and how we can start this process. Brent Leggs at the National Trust has become an ally in this fight. So, and these stories, I think they shape the narrative of Black mobility, Black ingenuity, strength, and entrepreneurship. They amplify a cultural memory. They reveal this untold story in the history of Black travel. Also the rise of the Black leisure class. And so to bring the Green Book out of the past and into the present, I'm also working on a digital interactive map to look at the issues of race, poverty, social mobility. I received a grant from National Geographic with seed money to start developing this map, and it will ultimately trace and examine, what does equality really look like for us, especially at this time. I'm also working on an exhibition with the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. It's the traveling arm of the Smithsonian, and I'm the content specialist and the curator for an exhibition we're developing. It's going to be about 3,500 square feet, and it will travel the U.S. for 3 years. There's the Lorraine Motel is really the National Civil Rights Museum is where this exhibition will open. It's a perfect venue because Lorraine was listed in the Green Book. And I'm working on developing multimedia archives for different cities to develop walking tours that will be inspired by the exhibition as well, so that people can actually see these places that are left, and you can actually go and either through an augmented reality feature on your phone, through a mobile app, to learn more levels about this history. And one of my dreams is to actually start a project where we're rehabbing these sites and hiring people either from the community or people transitioning out of prison and give them living wage jobs to bring these places back. Because even though at the Hampton House it was a $10 million project, that money didn't funnel back into the community. So figuring out ways to, there's a huge need for us to preserve this history, and so how do we really involve and move the needle in terms of real progress for the people who are living in these communities. And my book, Overground Railroad, will be released in January. It has stories of my stepfather Ron that run throughout the book, but it's also looking at all these different levels of what did the Green Book do in terms of the decades. It was in publication for nearly 3 decades, from the 30s to the 60s. And it looks at racial progress through the lens of the Green Book. It traces how that pendulum of justice would swing back and forth. History is, progress has never been a linear process. And when people say, it's 2019, how are we dealing with this? And it's like, well, when you look back at history, it makes sense. And so the book really is kind of a spotlight on that progress that we made and times when we didn't, when we fell back. And explains why we're still battling forces of white supremacy today. So in conclusion, I would like to thank again the Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center for this opportunity to do this work, to share this work. And if you would like to follow my project, my email is up there. I have business cards too. You can always grab a card from me or leave a card. And I'll add you to my updates list. I only send out about 4 a year, so I don't send out a bunch of email. But, and, you know, anxious to answer any questions when we do our time. But thank you again so much for your attention today.
Wow, thank you. I'm sure everybody has lots of questions and comments, but we are going to hold off until the end of the panel. So our next speaker is Anne Rasmussen. She is professor of ethnomusicology and Bickers Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at William and Mary. Anne has extensive experience doing field work. Am I speaking into the mic? Okay. Her research interests encompass music of the Middle East and Islamic worlds with a focus on Indonesia and the Arabian Peninsula, and also music and community in the multicultural United States. Her books include Women's Voices, The Recited Quran and Islamic Music in Indonesia, Divine Inspirations, Music and Islam in Indonesia, which was co-edited with David Harnish, The Music of Multicultural America, Performance, Community, and Identity in the USA, co-edited with Kip Lornell. She has quite the bio, so I think I'll stop there. And the title of her presentation today is Women Among Women, Sisterhood and Ethnographic Fieldwork in Muslim Indonesia. Thank you.
Very good. So I'm not using my computer. I'm going to rely on this technology here. Candace, thank you very much. And also Meredith, thank you very much for kicking off our afternoon. It's such a great honor and pleasure to be here at the American Folklife Center in the Library of Congress. I teach down the road in Williamsburg at the College of William and Mary, where I've been for 25 years. I'm hardly a native of Virginia, and this has really been my urban area. I've taught twice for our Washington, D.C. semester program, where I've done a full semester on Washington and the arts with a group of students who are also interning, and have just loaded up vans and brought students up here. And everyone has been so gracious here. I started doing field work for my Arab American work and Alan Jabor welcomed me, but now Todd and Betsy and Nancy and the crew at the Smithsonian and Steve and Judith Gray and John, thank you always for making me welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I feel like I have a hard act to follow after all of these excellent presentations, and I also feel like I have a big kind of stage bill. I am really here as an ethnomusicologist. I feel like I'm representing women ethnomusicologists in the rest of the world. We've been hearing about how diverse and wonderful the United States is. So I'm going to try to do all of that, talk to you a lot about my own field work, and also about a couple of themes that I'd like you to think about. Before I get into my work in Indonesia, my dissertation work was among the Arab American community. This is the cover of a record that I did with Rounder that features the greatest hits of Arab American musicians, men and women, recording between about the 19-teens to the 1960s. It's all remastered 78 recordings. And if a picture could speak 1,000 words, this one speaks at least 2,000. Two immigrant musicians standing on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. They're standing in front of Alamphone Records. You can see the Arabic on the top of the screen there. Alamphone, Farid Alam was as an entrepreneur. He made records. And by the gentleman's hand there, you see a poster in the window for Musa Cohen, a Jewish Egyptian singer who was featured in an upcoming event. So the material culture that I collected, mostly from these old timers, was really quite phenomenal. I began performing in the field as a young woman, by really apprenticing myself to these old timers. I traveled with my oud. They were much more interested that I was interested in learning music than they were that I was getting a PhD at the University of California at Los Angeles. That meant very little to them. And so in my early stage as a single girl, I was often, like a daughter or a granddaughter or a sister to older gentlemen and their wives who invited me into their homes or to their gigs and so forth. This gentleman, Joe Bedway, the women always called him the handsome Tarzan of the Arab American music scene. And these guys traveled up and down the coast. They said sometimes a triple header. We'd have something in Boston, then we'd go down to New York, and then, Sunday we'd be in North Carolina. They painted a very dynamic picture for me. I put this picture in here after being inspired by Anne's photos with recorders in there, and I thought Todd might enjoy it too. So I'm interviewing Russell Bunai, and he's got his portable cassette recorder there, and he's playing for me a qasida, a classical piece that he wrote based on the lyrics of one of the League of the Pen. The League of the Pen was a group of Lebanese literati, including Khalil Gibran, who were very tied up with the musicians. And then that microphone is, of course, me recording him, listening to the tape recorder. So we've got at least, double media there. I didn't think of myself doing work with women, but I certainly did work among women, not only among women singers, but also, as we see with Georgina Decky and Virginia Solomon, women patrons, women who were the shakers and the movers of their community, who organized parties, who contracted the musicians, who told them what to play, who figured out the food and the money. Most of these events were held for philanthropic purposes. And so while I felt like some of my colleagues, grad student colleagues in ethnomusicology were doing this really exciting work on gender, I didn't really see myself as teasing gender out of the equation. But many, many women were an important part of my field work and an important part of the scene. This is just an example of one of the events that Arab American musicians and community members had. The musicians are up here on the stage, and of course beautifully set tables, formal events. This community is from Greater Syria, Lebanon, which was then chopped up into Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and so forth. And it was really about 95% Christian, right? So Greek Orthodox, Melkite, Maronite, and so forth. And then here we have a record sleeve from Alamphone Records, the record company that I showed, with Senna and Amr Khadaj. Also really wonderful pieces of material culture. And then I went to contemporary events, and here, just looking through my photos, the documentary team is part of the labor of the wedding workforce in Detroit. That was at a Yemeni wedding, the picture on the right, and the picture on the left is the very hip Chaldean Iraqi band, more electronics. You don't find much wood or skin in those bands. It's all keyboards and drum machines, and that's Majid Kaka and the Bells Band. And the other record that I did was with Smithsonian and the exciting music of the supper clubs, the nightclubs, and this was a compilation of George Abdo and his Flames of Araby Orchestra. I wanted to name it Absolute Abdo, but I couldn't believe the Smithsonian actually went for belly dance. But so many of the contemporary dance community was ordering up these LPs, which then Folkways would make on cassettes. He did a whole number of albums on the Monitor label, which Folkways acquired. So I did a sort of best of compilation. And my other research is in the Sultanate of Oman in the Arabian Gulf. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but that's a very interesting situation to be in as a woman in the field, a woman mostly alone in the field. We can talk about that in the reception later on. And if you're interested in that work, I edited an issue of the journal The World of Music. All right, so let's talk about Indonesia. Indonesia is comparable to the United States in many ways, although it's an archipelago of thousands and thousands of islands and ethnic groups and languages. It's about as big as the United States in population and in area, about 280 million inhabitants. And my work is mostly from the tip of Sumatra to the tip of East Java There's the archipelago. And I'm really, at this point, trying to connect a whole Indian Ocean world. So the Arabian Gulf up here, and Islam comes to Indonesia through maritime trade and travel. And don't get me started, because then I'll go on for a long, long time. But there. So there's the archipelago, and there's the United States. So you can see it's about the same size. They also have some similar things going on there, like incredible xenophobia, populism, false news every day, real hardline Islam knocking at the door of every kind of traditional institution, including a very kind of tolerant, creative, artistic, and woman-centered Islam. So that's kind of the contemporary situation. The two main things that I've done on Indonesia are the book Women, the Recited Quran and Islamic Music in Indonesia, and then the book that I co-edited with David Harnish. And I think it kind of turned the tides of Indonesian ethnomusicology, which previously focused on the courtly art traditions, all the gamelan traditions and regional traditions, and saw Islam as kind of this intruder, that kind of a culture wrecker that's stamped around in cement boots. And this is due to, I think, a kind of stance of the colonial powers, prejudice in academia. And a number of my colleagues, sort of realized, there's this interesting Islamic thing that happens where I do field work also. So to see the Muslim religion as a creative place also, which is what my experience was. And of course, I came to Indonesia with this background in Middle Eastern studies and in Arabic language, and of course in Arab music, because that's what I did my PhD dissertation on. So a couple of the questions that I'm thinking about are, what are some of the, these dyads, like women in Islam, or, Islam and, you name it, Islam and X, or Islam and Y, as if Islam is we give it a personality as a kind of a monolithic entity. And I really try to break that down. Because I worked quite a bit with women, I'm thinking about women and community in Muslim Indonesia, and to what extent I'm a part of that community and when I'm not a part of that community. I can talk a little bit more about that, but this Muslim sisterhood, is it a unified thing, and can I be in it? And I take my cue mostly from Muslim feminists writing about, and there are many of them, Leila Ahmed, Laila Abul-Ghud, Sarah Mahmoud. And Leila Ahmed would write not, what is Islam or what is patriarchy, but rather, how do people live these institutions? How do we in the United States live the institution of patriarchy, right? Or how do we live the institution of motherhood or of feminism or of hashtag Me Too, right? How do I live through that myself or my community? I also would like to talk a little bit about fieldwork throughout the lifespan, and I think I had a slide, didn't I? Did I not? I don't know what happened to that slide. Let me just, since I can't see what's ahead of me, I wanted to talk about fieldwork in the lifespan. These are some themes as I sort of go through this tour. Fieldwork and family, fieldwork and female colleagues, and there's one more. Yeah, women among women. I guess the title of the presentation, right? So fieldwork through the lifespan, fieldwork and family, fieldwork and my female colleagues, and being a woman among women. This is Haja Maria Olfa. She is a world-renowned reciter of the Quran. She took me under her wing in 1996. And so that's more than 20 years ago. We've seen our children grow up together. We've slept in the same bed together, and I was sitting there thinking, like, okay, sleeping with the informant. Where does this go in my book? You know, we've been on the road together. She's met all of my family. I've met most of her family. It's a really interesting, strong relationship. So 3 pictures, all of them involving technology, right? This is making recordings of her in 1999. This is the 2 of us recording some material in the studio, in the recording studio. And I love, there's a picture of her sitting under a big photo of Bob Marley. Of course, she has no clue who Bob Marley is, and then just sitting right next to her on stage and getting a quick, shot of her reciting with my cell phone. Reciters in Indonesia, they recite, but they also sing. And because the way they recite is with the Arabic maqam, or system of scales, this is how the Arab music and the love of the Arabic musical world and all of the stars of the musical world and the reciters of the Arab world are so prominent in Indonesia and so important. So through Maria Ulfa and through performing with her, I learn about this world. So the black and white picture is at one of the largest and most important Islamic boarding schools in East Java. And this is a typical thing. You're like, oh, okay, Anna's here and she brought her oud. Let's do a show. And someone will quickly scribble some lyrics, and then I do my best to sort of hope that we're all in the same place and that I can follow along. Some things are a little bit more rehearsed. For example, the top photo is at the University of in Malang in East Java. And so getting to know people through musicking with them is one of the things that I've done, since I was a young woman, and often much more interesting to people than just blah, blah, blah. And understanding how it is that they think about music, how they put it together, how they organize it. One of the conundrums for me has been, how can Indonesia win international competitions in a practice that uses the Arabic language, which is not their language, and a system of an Arab musical system, which is also not their musical system. So how is it that they're thinking about that in terms of music theory? Women's bodies, women's voices, what's the big deal? I learned from sitting with young women, and these are mostly middle school, high school, and college age women at an event, but sitting with them and practicing with them how powerful how they were empowered by being able to do this religious thing and how powerful their voices were. I don't think I have time to play this excerpt, but what it says, it's a sheikh from Egypt, I could later on maybe, who says, women can learn and they can recite, and I have women who memorize, but their voices are aura, they're shameful, and they shouldn't be heard by men, and they shouldn't be heard in public. So this is the view in some cultures. But when I asked, we were not going to listen to him. When we talk about this word aura, let's look at Leila Ahmed. It means shameful and defective things. Its meanings include blind in one eye, blemished, defective, the genital area, generally parts of the body that are shameful and must be concealed, women's bodies, women's voices, and women. But when I ask women in Indonesia, well, what about this aura thing? They say, well, woman's voice in Indonesia, it's biasa saja. It's just regular. There's really no big deal. I will use this video here just to give you a sense of women in classes. Why don't you look at, note the single breath phrase. You can breathe with the young reciter if you dare. Watch the way she uses the mic. Watch the participation and reaction of fellow students, the green divider as the camera pans, and then the way Maria Ulfa demonstrates the Arab melodic mode and the ornamentation of this particular melody that she's trying to grab. And what do I do now? Let's actually, can we go back? Let's go back. So it doesn't take, nobody needs to understand Indonesian where she's going, you have to go, yeah, not like, but yeah. I mean, so how do they teach ornamentation? That's how they do it. All right. So when I was in graduate school, I was just thinking about what was really influential, and I remember Self, Sex, and Gender in Cross-Cultural Fieldwork was a really important volume. Ellen Koskoff did a guest gig at UCLA while she was putting her book together, Women in Music and Cross-Cultural Perspective. And then I went to school with Jane Sugarman, who was a huge influence on me, and who talked, I think her work is phenomenal. I mean, she really talked about the way in which music can not only reflect gender, but also project the ideals of gender, right? What does it mean to be, how does a music project what it means to be really masculine or really feminine, whether it's a Joni Mitchell feminine or a Janis Joplin kind of feminine? How is that kind of an ideal of womanhood? For recitation, is interesting. There is no girly style of recitation. Women are loud, they are strong, they are high, they are equally virtuosic. There's no, because you're channeling an archetypal kind of sound. And the way I think that women can get away with it is because they are not saying, look at me, I'm beautiful, I'm talented. They're saying, look at this comes from up there. I'm just channeling this original moment when the angel Gabriel gave Muhammad the very word of God, right? But excellence, virtuosity, hard work is absolutely prized. But so where does this come from, the permissibility of women's voices in the Indonesian context? Indonesia being the most populous Muslim country in the world. So looking back to Barbara and Daya, we see that from the before any religions had, thoroughly taken hold, from the 15th and 16th centuries, the advance of Islam and Christianity in island Southeast Asia introduced new articulations of messages stressing female spiritual and intellectual weakness. So thank you, monotheistic religion, for that. Across the region, it is possible to document the ways in which women were excluded from the most prestigious areas of religious practice. This issue is especially pertinent to Southeast Asian societies because in many areas, women and sexually ambiguous individuals played a leading role in indigenous rituals and in communication with the spirit world. For the most part, Islamic expansion in Southeast Asia underwrites a narrative of amicable localization rather than abrupt change and dislocation. So there is evidence for this kind of underlying permissibility of women's bodies and voices and intellectual and social power, I believe. Couple notes on representation. So how do I represent these women? How do I take what I know and move it out into the world responsibly? And one of the things I found, just to recap, I went for the first time in 95, 96 with my husband and one kid for his gig when I started this project. I returned in 1999 with a Fulbright and two kids, a 1-year-old and a 7-year-old, and we were there together. Then went back many times, mostly on my own, and then most recently had another Fulbright for just 6 months in 2017, all by myself, footloose, fancy-free, no kids. And certainly with family in the field, you are normalized, right? You come, you show up with your kids, they get you right away, right? They get who you are, as opposed to when I was sort of the single girl, working mostly, in groups of men and also being young and also being unmarried. Having your family there makes a huge difference. Even though my older son would complain, "I don't want to go to your stuff, Mom. It's always hot and the food is too greasy." That's what he used to say. So now, at my stage of the career, I find that, or this stage of my career, I find that I'm often asked to do presentations. I think I did like 29 performances and 19 lectures we talk about the way we do things. It's like you get a program 6 months out, year and a half out. You show up, they're like, "Oh, could you do a talk? Okay, how about Thursday?" And this is like Tuesday, right? And you show up Thursday, and there are 400 people in the room, and social media, and they've got a big, like a big banner across the back with your picture and like all these photos that they pulled off the web. It's amazing. But working with young women, working with young students, and just telling people what I do in the public forum, I think just helps to put myself out there. So if people have any objections or any contributions, which is usually the case, that can happen in these public fora. Another thing is to involve my closest sort of colleague interlocutors in presentations. This one was sponsored by the American Embassy, Indonesian Islam in the United States, right? So really trying to work collaboratively with colleagues, both in academic and musical ways. Maria Olfa has been to the United States twice and has been in this, in these various buildings around here. She was last here at the same time as the SEM conference when Betsy opened our pre-conference here in this building on the day of the presidential election. And it was I was saying like, I took them to the American History Museum, and Indonesians aren't that great about, they weren't that excited about tramping up and down the stairs. We did. I said, shame we didn't get to the third floor because, they have all the clothes of the president's wives. And her husband joked, her husband's a doctor, and he said, "Besok ada baju Bill." He said, "Tomorrow they're going to be Bill's clothes," thinking that Bill Clinton's clothes would be in the museum. Well, anyway, it was a monumentous experience for them to be here during the elections. But this is some of the things that they do with me. And it's really quite extraordinary to just kind of, see myself as kind of this capital that people use in various ways, which always kind of moves along my project. Sometimes you're a lot out of control, but it does get you out there in the public. Okay, so emancipation. What about these women? What is the motivation for women working in the business of religion, whether they're girls in Islamic boarding schools or women as professional reciters, teaching in colleges? In mixed groups, men play and women sing. And here are examples of some competitions, some groups getting ready for these various Islamic music genre competitions. But when they're on their own, they certainly play. And this is an example of Nasidaria, now in their 4th generation, an incredible group of very strong, very active women. Here is an example of a battle of the bands. below, and on top, women at another religious boarding school. I've been to many boarding, these religious boarding schools, Islamic boarding schools, and they always have music groups, and they always sort of parade them out for me. But this last time that I was in Indonesia, it was a particular, there were talking about just kind of what's in the air politically and socially. So obviously the front page of the Jakarta Post takes no explanation. I got there just as Trump was being inaugurated. But at the same time, this is a poster for several hardline Islamist groups. So they call this Islam Keras, hardline Islam, or Islam extreme, or just right-wing Islam that it mostly comes from outside of Indonesia. This is kind of a pan-global phenomenon, and it is really pushing against traditional institutions of creativity, of woman-centered activity, of kind of syncretic practice that involves Islamic practice, but also that allows in all of this local kind of Javanese-ness and so forth, whether it's burning incense or having a 7-month blessing ceremony for a woman who's 7 months pregnant. Definitely a very Javanese thing, but also, very Indonesian. Javanese and Indonesian, but done as a Muslim thing now, right? So these hardline groups would say, no, that's haram. So this is certainly in the news on a daily basis, and just, xenophobia, intolerance, violent, hostile, aggressive. All of this was sort of in the air. And speaking with Indonesia's feminist activists about these issues is also a part of my work. The way in which patriarchy and religion, that kind of dangerous combination that's used to censor women and prohibit things like riding motorcycles after 8 o'clock at night, certain things like that. And so these are two really important activists in Jakarta, and Cirebon, who I interviewed. So I was back there for just for 3 weeks this summer. And my book, Women, the Recited Quran and Islamic Music in Indonesia, was translated into Indonesian. I felt when I went there in 2017 that it was my ethical responsibility to get this thing translated and say, okay, look, I got tenure, I'm a full professor, you helped me do this. I did it on your backs because your stories are interesting, and I was able to weave them into, however many presentations I've done. So I wanted to get that off the ground, and it came out this summer, and I went back, and in about 3 weeks, there were sort of 6 book launching events that happened. And everybody was sort of holding up the book saying, look, see, our Islam, it's tolerant, it's creative, it's diverse, it's woman-centered. And they, again, really used me and my work as an opportunity to say, this is us. Because every single college campus is worried about right-wingers and this kind of conservatism that creeps in, and you can see it in the way people dress, you can see it in the way people act. And so in this seminar up there, I'm with a religious kiai, a religious leader, and a literature professor, and then the guy in white, he said, this is going to be awesome, Anne. He says, it's a simple event, but look who I got. I got this major religious leader and the greatest literary. And I said, okay, sounds good to me. I'll do what I can. And then this is a community of people that I've worked with for a long time in Yogyakarta, Emha Ainu Najib and his wonderful ensemble, Kiai Kenjeng. It's extraordinarily humbling and gratifying to just see what people have sort of done with me and my work. Do I have time to just talk about these couple more points? Yes. Yeah? Okay. 2 minutes. Okay, so yeah, field work through the lifespan, you know, from single girl to married woman to wife to mother to this sort of independent woman, musician, professor, mentor, teacher, colleague, advisor, collaborator, leader that I feel like I am, you know, right now. You know, one thing that Indonesian women asked me, or, you know, we talked about, is that I said, well, you know, if you're a working woman in the United States, you don't have people to take care of your kids or to do grocery shopping or to do anything like that. And most Indonesian households do have a lot of people around to kind of help with all that stuff. I've been extraordinarily lucky to have parents who have helped out and so forth, but nobody ever moved in to take care of our kids. So, you know, so that was a different, but just talking to women about sort of balancing career, husband, how many kids do you have? And people are extraordinarily frank there about kind of the challenges of women in families, in marriages, in professional lives, and trying to balance all of those things. Family and fieldwork. Well, I was trying to look for some pictures of my darling children when they were little, but my darling children came over in 2017, and because they have such a place for Indonesia in their hearts, it was great to have them back doing, this was a workshop we did at the Arts University in Solo, so that's my older son Hanson, my younger son Luther, 27 and 21. Now, here we are playing a gig at the Malang train station. Don't knock it until you tried it. And then my husband was here, and I was getting ready to go on stage, and I said, he said, oh, I'm not going on stage. I said, oh, yes, you are, dear. Because tomorrow these pictures are going to be all over Facebook, and it is very important that these people see me with a husband at least once, because usually I'm just, you know, flying around, dragging my suitcase and my instrument, or taking the night train or something like that. I say, you get on that stage and deal with it. So it's been great to sort of have this family legacy. Fieldwork and female colleagues, very quickly. I think in our world right now, in the field of ethnomusicology, there among younger colleagues, there's a real concern about being completely unprepared by mentors for being a woman in the field when you're young. Lily Gordon put together a fantastic panel and said, you know, warning, trigger alert, misogyny, sexual abuse, rape, danger, and having women talk to each other about what we might face in doing field work has been something that's been kind of quiet. And yeah, kind of quiet. Also relationships that women have in the field. You know, these things, you don't really write about them. Some people have written about them, and men never write about them, right? But, you know, women that I know who have married the field and what that's like, and trying to come back here and have a career with a man that you've fallen in love with in the field and come back with, that's a real challenge for women. My colleagues who have put off marriage, who have put off child having until, you know, it's no longer possible, right? Or they don't want it. So, I mean, I think there really are some things to think about there as we move forward and think about what is it to do field work as women. And we could ask all of those questions of all those wonderful women that we talked about this morning. So I think that's about it. We are women among women in the field. Men, we are absolutely delighted that you're here, and you know, we should all be here together, but it's high time that we have a look. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne, for that wonderful, very reflexive presentation. Just to plug the book again, we do have a chapter called Issues in the Field where we do talk about sex and sexuality. And it was interesting when we got the reviews on that section, because our reviewers had opinions about that section.
I would imagine.
So
Yeah.
But also just to say that men are also really gendered and also have very gendered experiences in the field, and we don't talk enough about that. And so That's not what I'm supposed to be talking about right now, but. So we now have about 20 minutes for some Q&A, and I will start with a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor to everybody. So my questions are going to be less content-y and more kind of thinking about being women in the field. And you both brought up things that I wanted to ask about, but I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about them. So some of the things that I thought about from kind of a feminist perspective are things like family. And interestingly, you each mentioned in very different ways relationships between family and field work. Other issues that I thought you both raised, but then in different ways, was thinking about bodies, like inhabiting different bodies and being in those bodies when you're in Detroit or in Indonesia, and very different what that means to be in a particular body as you're trying to do field work. And the other thing, which you all didn't really speak about directly, but I think we need to speak more about, is emotion, and recognizing that as we are embodied people, we are also people with emotions. And often when we're doing field work, there's a lot of pressure to kind of not pay attention to our own emotions, and we are attentive listeners, we are engaged field workers, and we are also people who are having emotional responses, or just our own emotions as we're navigating. So I thought I would throw those three ideas out. So family, body, and emotion, and let you all choose one, or they could be interrelated, that you'd like to speak a little bit about before we open the floor.
Can you hear me? Okay. That's interesting. I've been doing this work for about over 20 years, and I've done several different kinds of projects, from being when I documented female bullfighters, and I was in Mexico, and and I would always get harassed because I would be taking photos in the presidential circle where no women were supposed to be, and so there were just like these annoyances of just, do you deserve to be here? You're a woman, why are you here? And I was always conscious of being female pretty much in every project, but it wasn't until I did the Green Book project that my physical body was really in danger, for reasons not just from the exterior. I mean, I think emotionally, because it hit me so hard in terms of being a black woman, and my stepfather, he told me stories he had never told me before, even though I'd known this man since I was 12. He trusted me with these stories about his family being chased by the Ku Klux Klan and all of these things. And so it opened up my heart in a way that, and I started having heart problems, literally. And I don't have them now that I've moved through this, but it was an interesting thing. On the road, there were 3 different times I was in the emergency room with potential strokes.
Oh my God.
And my family and my friends were like, this project isn't worth your life, But my things were in storage in LA, so there was no home for me to go to, really. So I was like, okay, so what does that mean? I'm in the but they would do CT scans. They were like, half my face would be numb from, so they'd say, go to the emergency room. This isn't something to fool around. Go to the emergency room, they do the CT scan, and it would be, they would say, you're okay. And so I'd just be back on the road again. And, I talked to my sister, and she was like, are you crazy? Like, why are, but I think it was literally the emotional weight of this material was so intense for me, and it still is, that I think it just started manifesting itself physically for me. And I figured, well, it's what I love to do, and if it's my time, it's my time. I mean, I can't, I wasn't going to not do the work. But then, most days I just don't think about it. I just do what I need to do and deal with, But looking back on it, it does seem a little crazy that it just never occurred to me to stop or figure out, I thought I was taking care of myself as best I could, but I do think there were these existential kind of forces that were, that were driving me to keep doing the work, but also, physically manifesting itself in my body.
Yeah, I guess maybe kind of a mashup of those three topics, family, body, and emotion. I remember once I went to this competition I was up in Kalimantan, so it was like a week long, 2004. And usually, I think, I've written about this, as a woman, you can often get into a man's world because you occupy this weird place. You're not like one of their women, right? You're this other kind of woman. You're this academic woman. You're a foreign woman. And you're a smart woman. And so you can, go to meetings or go do interviews. And it looks like all I do is hang out with women, but, like all worlds, this is a very male-dominated world as well. And I remember at this thing, I got stuck with the wives, and I had to go jewelry shopping with the wives. I had to go out to ice cream with the wives. It was killing me because there was this cohort of wives to hang out with. Had the cohort of wives not been there, I could have been in all the meetings with the guys, right? But I remember just being so frustrated for inhabiting this body that I inhabit. But I did get some very lovely jewelry for all of my families, my aunts and I. We were in Kalimantan. They have these really nice stones. Sometimes men, I'll make an appointment with somebody, and they'll show up with a buddy, and it's like they've self-policed themselves not to be alone with me, even at my age. Right? And I'm thinking, why? And I think, it's just safer. It's just better that we're not just the two of us by ourselves. And then it makes me wonder, if I am with a man all by myself, like, are people looking? Like, is that a bad thing? The other thing, I wanted to ask you a question, Candace, but being all by myself now, like when I'm in the field, it's like I go from these intensely sort of social, peopled spaces to sort of going back to some, kind of 3-star hotel room and, just being happy to be alone, but then hours alone and just trying to kind of create some psychological balance, so I know that if I can find one long walk per day, or, if I can take myself for a swim or do, this much on my computer and this much and then this much and then have one appointment, but still without not having somebody to share, to get feedback, like, oh my God, could you believe it when he did that? Or could you believe how hot it was? Or could you believe how long we had to sit there and, sit on the floor with our legs crossed and, and then I get ready and I go out and I put on my long sleeves or, whatever you need to wear for the occasion and sort of take a deep breath and say, as Sammy Davis Jr. said, when I walk out of the house, I'm on, right? But I wanted to ask you, Candace, did you have an RV or a pop-up van, or did you have to find a motel every night when you're driving your 4,000 miles, or could you? You did. So
no, I love hotels.
Okay, all right.
No, I mean that was the gift I had after a 16-hour day. I knew I was going to be. I have, my agent. It was so funny because Priceline, I use Priceline religiously, and I mean my write-offs I think for last year for travel were over close to $60,000, and I only use Priceline. So apparently I get these VIP deals in Priceline. My agent, I was looking for a hotel in New York, I was like, this is $100. She was like, it's not $100 if I order it through Priceline. And I realized it's like I have this incredible, so I get these really good deals that are $60, $70, $80, $100 in these beautiful hotels. And so it's only at the end of the day, no matter what I'm dealing with, it's like I look forward to just being quiet and, ordering food in. I don't order room service because it's too expensive, but I'll go and pick it up and bring it in, So I make it work for me, but no, I love, I think I love hotels almost as much as I love the work. I mean, it really is a thing for me.
So you're not staying across the street from some of those buildings that we saw.
No,
Yeah.
no. I mean, and even when I get invited over people, it's like again, plus at the end of the day, you decompress. I mean, that's when I can get all my data, put it together. I need to focus, so it is still work, but it's a different, but it's in a nice environment.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, going back and forth between, these different worlds, right? These worlds where either, I'm staying in somebody's home and, there are little critters that crawl out of the drain, and you're doing a kind of shower where you dip the dipper, even in very nice homes. I mean, that's what it's like. And you're sort of eating food that's not necessarily what you would make for yourself. And then going to the Borobudur Hotel where they have a beautiful pool and whatever, and just, they have a beer in the mini fridge,
It's cold.
Yeah, that's cold, and kind of knowing that there are these spaces where you can just kind of get out of that skin and occupy your regular body, send out all your emails and whatever, yeah.
Well, I have so many questions that just came up in relation to that, but I will open it up to the floor because we don't have a whole lot of time. So do we have questions or comments?
I
Yes.
was curious about being blonde in Indonesia. I know a lot of researchers who try to find cultures where they will blend in and not be noticed. And I wondered how that worked for you.
There's no way I can't be noticed.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm tall. I'm bigger than most of the men. And yeah, I mean, I'm just, and people are interested in what my, my Scandinavian heritage is. And it's interesting. I was talking about, how in the United States, we're this very kind of multicultural place, and everybody comes from different roots, ethnic, national, whatever. And but I said, look, we just had lunch, and everybody went around the room, and they said, oh, my wife is from Manado. Oh, my husband is from here. And they do sort of that same thing by saying, I come from this group of people that have this special food and live in this special place and have this special music and, clothes and so forth. So so people make these kinds of distinctions about hair and tradition and amongst themselves too. Yeah, I'm definitely an outsider. But again, I think this idea that I came in with this sort of expertise about Arabic music, which has a particular prestige in Indonesia and a particular sense of religiosity. Even a pop song is like partly religious just because it's in Arabic, right? So that was sort of my, that was my cred, I guess, to be someone that was interesting to talk to and hang out with.
Candace, I had a question for you about your the diner project, because on the videos that I saw online, it was mostly white women, and I'm guessing those a lot of really white communities, and I'm wondering what your experiences were there.
Yeah, the counterculture was challenging for me because I never really knew what I was walking into. I mean, there was a place in Mississippi, for example, that had been a card-carrying place back in the day, meaning that after integration happened, you needed a card to be in, which meant you needed to be white. And I was interviewing a woman, Rivers. She was in her 80s, and it was just one of those days where I was like, this is a day I'm not so excited about my job, because I would try to send pictures of myself in articles so people would know I was black, because maybe if they talked to me, they wouldn't necessarily know from my voice. And so I tried to give people a heads up ahead of time, so it wouldn't be, so they would know, and then I probably feel more comfortable that they knew. So there were those kinds of, choices I made. But the waitress project in particular was so interesting because it was so hard to find women of color who had waitressed for decades. Like all the women in the project had waitressed, at least, 50 years in the same type of restaurant. And the women from that generation, it was really only white women that were allowed to be in the front of the house. So once I really, I did include some black and Latino women, but it was really, challenging to find them. But everybody treated me with respect, and I made a lot of wonderful connections with all the women, so I didn't have any issues at all. It's a good question, though. Thanks.
This is a question for Candace. Thank you so much. I was thinking about your ethnography of buildings if there weren't people, if the business wasn't still around, but you had, traveled for miles and miles, and like you said, you went to jump up and down. And I'm just wondering, because it's something that I've considered, wanting to do, is to visit some of these sites. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about, you take a picture and sort of how you find meaning in that building where you're not doing an interview.
Well, I mean, to me, these green book sites come in all different shapes and sizes and architecture, and that's why the Graham Foundation grant, it was an architecture grant, to really look at these buildings. And I did get a grant from National Park Service to register them for the to nominate them for the National Registry. So I'm working on that work now. I think buildings are really important. I know that, and in terms of gender too, because a lot of times we want the stories and, architecture, and it's very kind of male-centered usually. But believe me, it's a lot easier to photograph buildings than it is to photograph people. So in some ways, it's less, it's a different kind of work. The challenge is finding them, really. I mean, that's really the biggest struggle. But I think when you're photographing buildings or you're looking at these places, I mean, it's really the context of where they are, the neighborhoods they're in, what, how many, they're just, if everything around them been leveled, what state they're in, because some of them are literally just boarded together and falling apart. So to me, it's a huge tapestry of, there's so much to experience with a building. So yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? So with the Green Book, you had exact addresses for most places? So it was...
The Green Book lists, and it's so funny, sometimes they'll just have a P.O. box or they'll just have a name, but most of the listings in the Green Book have an address, but some of them are wrong. I went to in L.A., I went to a place over and over again in Skid Row, and had photographed, and because I was looking also, I'm interested in these places as cultural heritage sites, even if there's no even if they're completely different now. If it's the same building, I look at the assessor's record to see when it was built to make sure it was that building. And I kept going to the same building in LA, and I thought this doesn't look like it was ever a hotel. And I'd look at the address in the book, and I was like, and then one day I just drove from the other direction, and it was across the street, and it was still operating with its name. It's just like, so there were a lot of mistakes in the Green Book too. That was a big lesson. It's like, look around. If I just turned around, but I was so kind of just laser focused on this address. So. But they're all there. It's a huge archive of of this history. Thanks for the question.
Well, I have a question while you all are thinking of yours. So in our panel in the morning, there was talk about technology and this whole idea that women can't use technology and kind of some of the challenges with that. So you're both field workers, and you showed pictures of technology. Candace, you mentioned you had somebody doing the videography for you. I'm curious about your own relationships with technology.
I wish mine were better. I wish I had better support in my institutions. I have a house full of technology now, and things that need to be transferred and to responsibly steward and shepherd all of those things along is a real concern of mine right now. I think most of my things are pretty well organized, and I spent a good deal of the summer trying to get things more organized. I think I decided early on that I wasn't really recording to make records or make films, although I would love to travel with a filmmaker. Some of my more successful things techniques have been to give my equipment over to somebody else, especially when I'm busy doing something, and just let them have at it. And I just give them my camera and say, please, take pictures or take videos and see what you come up with. And then, of course, coming back and processing all of that. I mean, I have a lot of unprocessed things. You process enough to give that paper, and then that paper becomes an article, and you're always working towards a deadline, particularly if you've, got this other job that involves teaching and meetings and so forth. Interestingly, I found that in Oman, I got myself a nice digital SLR camera. I put that thing around my neck. People knew who I was and why I was there. And they're like, oh, please come to the front. They just ushered me right up to the front with all the journalists. It was absolutely, and sometimes I just would snap hundreds of pictures just to be doing something so that people could see I was doing that. So it it was kind of a powerful weapon of like, look who I am, In Indonesia, everybody is recording everybody all the time. So I was often, my recorder was one of, 20 on the coffee table recording some class or some event or something like that. So it's nothing like, you get it out and everybody goes, oh, she's going to record. It's like, no, completely normal. And of course now with phones, it's ultra normalized.
Well, it's so funny. I mean, it couldn't be more opposite for me because, especially for this project, I'd have to hide my camera all the time. It's like I can't show that I have it because it makes me a target for either violence or even just people don't like being people just want to know why you have a camera. So it's interesting that, I've just found that like bags that look like it's not real equipment, that it's not, just as nondescript as possible, under the radar as possible. But I have to say, my master's degree is in visual criticism. I got it in like 2002. Yeah, I graduated 2002, so it was a long time ago. But originally, I was a scenic painter for film and television, and I've been an artist all my life. And so being a fine artist and having that, going into grad school, that program, visual criticism, kind of liberated me from being a painter into realizing that it's not the medium that's important. It's the story and it's the content. It's like what you're trying to say is more important. So it really allowed me to, focus on film for the female bullfighters project. And I picked up the camera for the first time when I did counterculture, and the camera stayed with me. But then I started writing books, and so it really, I think I can learn how to use a camera, but really the conceptual work that it takes to unearth a story and the layers and make it accessible to people and have them and present it in a way that they want to care about it, that's the real work to me. So the technology is always changing. So as soon as you think you've mastered something, it changes anyway. So I really don't, it's more to me, it's about the tools that I need on the road and how to keep them as streamlined as possible. I mean, I did have to, in terms of your question about buildings, I did have to figure out a way to show these buildings so they're not just, so they look more interesting. And it was the first time I ever, played around with this kind of ephemeral quality and in Photoshop with clarity. And it's not that they're blurred, but I found a way to just make them look a little more ethereal. And so that was something I had to do to just make it look more interesting. But, but it's kind of as needed. It's not a static thing that, that I would have to say this is, what I do, and this is, because I don't even call myself, that's why I call myself a cultural documentarian and not just a photographer or writer, because all of these things, kind of come in and out of focus as needed.
Could I add one little thing to the technology thing? So Todd Harvey gave me some advice about going through my Arab American materials, which had been sitting in the basement and in the garage, and I was feeling very guilty and nervous and thinking that they were all moldy and disgusting. And so I went through everything and I documented. I've got about 75 cassettes of interviews and recordings of music events and mixtapes that people have given me of things that they did, like when I was in a toddler, like this is us jamming in the living room, in 1962 or something like that. And Todd said, don't play them. They'll, whatever. But I would look at this cassette and I was like, what? I think this is what is this? And then, so I put it in and they all sound great. And it was just such an amazing thing to just put those cassettes in my, my machine at home and say, wow, this is all still there.
Go cassettes.
Go cassettes. And I mean, I did.
Todd's listening.
I know he is. I think I already confessed this to him. But I mean, my heart bounced to know that some of that stuff is still there.
Yay.
Yeah.
Well, we are. Can we take a
question and then we'll take a 10-minute break?
Okay. Yes.
You touched a little bit on this before, where you mentioned that you wrote the people ahead of time sometimes, but if either of you ever like were researching people, like meeting people that you wanted to interview cold, did you do that, and how do you do that? Like, I think of an experience I've had where I walk by a church that I don't know the people, and they're singing in a different language, and the harmony, I'm entranced, but I don't know, like, what, do I just walk in? Do I go to church for a few weeks and then say, hey, or how do you, bring that up and introduce yourself and see if they're interested?
Sure, I can jump on that. Well, I think this is, your neighbor asked me about my hair. And I think because I am so unusual, I can sort of poke my nose in and say sorry, and then people are usually excited that I can speak Indonesian well, in the Indonesian context. In doing fieldwork in Oman, people are much more reserved. They're not nearly as kind of out there. In Indonesia is an extremely friendly place. And then since I can, again, being so public about what I do, since I can get to it quickly, I said, I'm doing research on such and such, or I'm really interested in this, or such and such. And then, I said, that's so interesting. May I record you? Just like that. And then, even if it's just a 10-minute conversation or something, I just ask. But I don't know if I would be brave to do that to just waltz into an awesome church that had cool music coming out of it. I don't know if I would be that brave here.
So something about being in a different country.
I think the otherness sometimes can help. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I'm kind of a planner. I really do make sure that I have, even with the waitress project, even if I found a waitress who I wanted to interview, she probably wouldn't have time, if I walked into that place. So then I'd have to usually schedule a time, with her later. And maybe, to me it just seems like I just feel like it's a huge gift for people to share their lives with me, whatever, even if it's just an hour. And, and all of the material that I gather and all the things I do with that material in terms of whether it's on NPR or whether it's archived at the library or whether it's on television or, it's like they really have to trust me. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like when I start that kind of relationship with somebody, I don't expect to just walk up to them and have them give this to me. I don't think they, So for me, it, even when I did all the scouting, I went there first and then went back. Those scouting trips were just like, I'm here, I'm just in the car, I'm getting, I'm just kind of surveying what's there. And then I take another trip, however many months later, after I've already reached out to them, I've shown them my work, they understand, what I want, and I see, if this is really something that they care about or want to be a part of, because I think it's, when you're dealing with people and the interview process to me is very intimate, and I don't expect to just have that, on the street with somebody. So I was trying to think if it's ever even really happened like that. And I'm sure it has probably once or twice, but it's rare. It's really rare. But, there's nothing, if you're in a place and you're not going to be able to go back, all people can do is say no unless you feel like, you're in a threatening or dangerous place. So, I think that's personal choice.
After that lovely testimony, I just have to add, I don't just, go walking around with a microphone clipped to my belt. Most of my communications go on through WhatsApp. Everybody uses this, so appointments and, introducing yourself to people and making formal appointments. But I would think maybe more in the context of a festival when there are a lot of people milling around and, you meet somebody interesting and you're sort of there and they know you're there doing something, and then being able to do a kind of impromptu conversation. So it's not quite as spontaneous and slipshod, I guess, as I made it sound. I appreciate your...
If I could just add, as somebody who teaches a lot of fieldwork and makes my students go out and interview and go into spaces where they are often scared, is one of the things that I found, and I agree completely with everything that they've said, but is that people usually really enjoy talking about themselves, and especially if you're talking about something like some cultural, like music or art, that, to have somebody come and say, wow, I really love your music, would you talk to me about that, or can I listen? A lot of times people appreciate that, like they appreciate your interest, and especially with interviews, as somebody who likes to talk, it's like, somebody's going to listen to you for an hour, and they're not going to say anything, they just really want to hear, so, what I found is a lot of times that my students who are the most scared of doing interviews often come at the end and are like, wow, that was so amazing. It was really cool. Maybe they interviewed their mom, or maybe they interviewed somebody they didn't know before, but they found that the person really told them some really interesting things, and it was a really, really neat interaction. And so I'm thinking about the church thing, because one of my jobs in graduate school was a project on community and religion in Indianapolis, and we literally had to go to every single faith-based institution in a neighborhood and go to a service and interview and go like to a potluck or something. And the faith-based institutions particularly tend to be open to outsiders, not always, but there are places where you can often go to a service, or you can call somebody in the office or the person in charge and say, hey, I'm interested. They're often interested in outreach. So yes, relationship building, it's hard, but also it's very doable, and it's really fun. So with that, I think we are out of time. So let's give our panelists a big hand.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to
I
hear
think
about your work.
we're taking a break, and then we're going to reconvene.
To the last short panel.
First of all, I want to thank the last panel for a really exceptional discussion. I think that it was just wonderful. And I want to thank both Anne and Candace for a look at contemporary field work. We're going to go back now to highlight some of our archives. And I'm delighted to introduce Todd Harvey, my colleague and a reference archivist who's a curator of the Alan Lomax collection here, the Lomax collections here, but he also knows just about every other archive collection that we have. Dr. Harvey holds a graduate degree in music composition from Ohio State, and has a library science degree from Catholic, and has recently put out a book on Alan Lomax and his 1938 collecting trip to Michigan and the northern Midwest, and has also published widely, including books on Dylan and his the stylistic influence on Dylan by for various sources. That's sort of a classic among Dylan scholars, but his real area of expertise is the Lomax and Lomax circles, and we've asked him today to talk about Bess Lomax Hawes, Ruby Lomax, and the women in the Lomax circle. So please make him welcome, Todd Harvey.
Thanks, Nancy. Wow, that was a really interesting panel. I spent most of my time in the 1940s, and I'm ready to move up to the modern day, listening to you all talking about your work. It's, the whole day has just been like that. I'm very conscious of being male here now, and it's kind of odd. People ask me what I do, and I say, oh, I'm a reference archivist at the American Folklife Center, and they get this blank look, like, what? I say, I take care of, Lomax, Seeger, and Guthrie, thinking that, it'll give us something that they understand. They kind of shake their heads, but they don't realize that I'm talking about Anna Lomax, Tina Seeger, and Nora Guthrie, the people who run the stuff now. Back to Lomax, right? The 1930s. So the first panels today show pretty clearly that throughout the 20th century, documentation of expressive culture was done by both women and men. And I have an interesting little article that I often cite. It's from the June 1937 issue of Southern Folklife Quarterly. And the title is List of Collectors and Persons Interested in the Ballad and Folk Song Field. And it goes region by region. And what is really striking to me is that for every Phillips Berry you have Joanna Colcord and Helen Harkness Flanders. And for every, Samuel Bayard, you have Martha Beckwith and Geraldine Chickering and Mary Eddy and all of Dame Campbell. And it just shows that there are a lot of women working in the field even in 1937, and I think that's a good place to start, a good place to think about. Also, something that I have noticed in looking at collections, and I don't have statistics on this, but a lot of people tended to work in teams, in pairs, for a lot of reasons, but I think it's no accident that the early American Folklife Center field projects called Flash Hours kind of model of teams of people working with their individual specialties, special assignments happened, and it's because people were doing that for a long time, and there are to state the obvious. We each bring different skills to field work, and field work is pretty complex work. You have to have interpersonal skills, logistical skills, technical skills, and it's not present company accepted. It's not usual that everybody has all of these skills, and it can be pretty lonely work. And so working together makes a lot of sense. And when you talk about the Lomax men, Alan Lomax and John Lomax, they worked together for about 2 years. Really, that's it, from 1933 to 1934, and then they were pretty much done with each other. And from that period on, right, the period that Alan especially worked in the field from 35 to about 67, he worked with other people, and so did John. They always worked as teams, and it was almost always a family members, spouses, professional colleagues, lovers, and it was almost always women that worked with Alan or John, and so it makes sense that we would talk about those women today. And so what I'm going to do is a quick kind of splash through the different people who are working with the Lomaxes, and I broke it into a couple of pieces. But the great place to start, of course, is the Southeast United States, the Bahamas and Haiti, 1935 to 1937. And it doesn't get much better than going into the field with Zora Neale Hurston, I don't think. She and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle knew each other and both knew Alan, and they all decided that in 1935 they would take a trip down to the southeast through Gullah Geechee country and to Eatonville. And the subject expert was Zora Neale Hurston. Barnacle brought some funds, some experience in the field, and institutional kind of cachet, and Alan, all of 20, wasn't working for the library at the time, but also brought that kind of institutional support. And they made a lot of great recordings and had a lot of experiences. I want to read you a little bit from, so Zora, turn now all to our copies of Their Eyes Were Watching God, chapter 18. And so she says, since Tea Cake and Janie had befriended the Bahamian workers in the glades, the Saws, had been gradually drawn into the American crowd. They quit hiding out to hold their dances when they found that their American friends didn't laugh at them as they feared. Many of the Americans learned to jump and liked it as much as the Saws, so they began to hold dances night after night in the quarters, usually behind Tea Cake's house. Often now, Tea Cake and Janie stayed up so late at the fire dances that Tea Cake would not let her go into the field with him the next day. He wanted her to get some rest. So the scene that she's describing is a scene that they actually documented in 1935. And it's right there in their logs, Bahamian fire dancers. We saw them. And what's equally cool is that she's writing this a year later, right? Hurston was in Haiti, and probably a few Hurston scholars in here who know more than I do about this, but she was in Haiti working on this book, among other things. She had some sort of Fulbright or something that she was doing field work. And she suggested to Alan that he might come to Haiti and do some field work himself. He convinced the library to support the project, and she made all of the introductions. She told him how to get letters of introduction to whom, said, come when you get to Haiti, come find me, I'll be here. And so, again, she was his guide to this, and it's kind of funny that she was writing this book about, some of it was about their experiences the year before in Eatonville or wherever exactly they were. For her part, Mary Elizabeth Barnacle was an NYU professor, and her papers are at Eastern Tennessee State Universities, and her sound recordings are there. Her papers are at Harvard, so you can do a lot of research on her. I mean, Hurston's papers at the University of Florida, and a lot of her recordings are here at the library. Barnacle has a place in history in that when John Lomax and Leadbelly were trying to establish themselves in New York in 1935, in the winter of 1935, she lent them a house in Wilton, Connecticut, so that they could hang out. And they did a lot of recordings there. A lot of the great Leadbelly recordings were made there. So another interesting person, this is Elizabeth Lomax. This is, she was married to Alan they got married in Haiti in 1937, and they stayed married until about 1949 or 1950, I think. And she went with him on a couple of trips in 1937 and 38. And one was Kentucky, and this is one of my favorite. It's a still from some silent film footage we have, but she's sitting there and clearly doing the operating part of on the Presto disc recorder. I couldn't help but put up a little scan of the Studebaker that they bought to take on the trip. That we have this documentation is fabulous. She is pretty interesting. She did this trip with him. She did the next trip to Ohio and Indiana, and that was pretty much done. Being on the road with Alan Lomax, I think, took a toll on just about anybody. And she also didn't like living in Washington. And this is a picture of the dust jacket for the recording session for the House of the Rising Sun, the original version of that the Lomaxes recorded. She was there. This is a nice photograph of them from about 1938. When Alan announced that he was going for a 4-month trip to the Upper Midwest, Elizabeth said, "I'll be in Mexico City if you need me," and she stayed there for a bunch of a while. I'm not really sure how long, and really embarked on her career as a writer, and that was she's quite successful as a writer, more successful than Alan, I would think, as a screenwriter, she would adapt great novels in a kind of condensed form as one of her gigs. She wrote for radio. She wrote novels. She spent the later part of her life as a philanthropist in New York City, and died only a few years ago. She's hard to find much about, though, outside of the context of Alan, and biography of her is overdue.
Did she keep the name Lomax?
No. No. She married, I forget his first name, but his last name was Sturz, Sturz, and that's how you would find her, Elizabeth Sturz, or Elizabeth Harold, which is her name before she married Alan. The fourth of the regional studies that the archive undertook, 1939, Alan connected with the very experienced field worker Helen Harkness Flanders, who had been doing field work since the 1930s as well, about 1930. And really, Alan was along for the ride on this one. She had all the contacts. She knew who she wanted to record. The recordings are here. I presume the good field notes about the project are with her papers at Middlebury, a great archive online material from all of her collection. She did, I would say, much more recording than Alan did, 4,000 discs or something like that, 4,000 recordings. A pretty amazing field worker, Helen Harkness Flanders. In this is kind of an aside, but the radio research projects in Alan in 1941 to record the Mountain Music and Dance Festival in North Carolina, and one of the people they ran into was Margot Mayo of the American Square Dance Group. And often when you are reading along in these kinds of articles or things that I am encountering when I'm looking at Lomax things, you'll find a way to veer left very hard. And when you run into Margot Mayo, veering left is a good idea because of her extensive field work in Kentucky, and then the American Square Dance Group, which is instrumental in the square dance revival and the folk dance revival of New York. We could look at our Easy Young collection to learn more about that. That would take you then into Friends of Old Time Music and the New York scene, and you could just go on and on forever and ever like that. Margot Mayo, we have the possibility of getting Margot Mayo's papers sometime soon, so don't tell anybody, but we're going to get those. The two Rubies. Ruby Tara Lomax, a dean of women at the University of Texas, who was a powerful academic figure and who also happened to be married to John Lomax in 1939, 1940, 1941. She accompanied John on his semi-annual swoops through the country from their home in Dallas to Washington, where he was supposed to be, and they recorded. And because of Ruby, we have the only decent field notes that John Lomax ever took. In other words, she wrote them, and pretty good documentation, photography. She was very organized. And on one of those trips, in the 1940 trip, you had Bess Lomax going along, later Bess Lomax Hawes, John's daughter, and Alan's sister, a major figure. Y'all probably know who she is, but I would, if you don't, the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, Folk Arts Program, probably wouldn't have happened if it were not for Bess, and that's a pretty big deal. This is a nice picture of the other Ruby Pickens Tart, who was a local contact for the Lomaxes, and it shows you, as an example, every place that they went, they were relying on local contacts in order to do the work. Ruby Pickens Tart was one of those people in Livingston, Alabama. This is a picture that really typifies the John Lomax work. The recording machine is in the car. The microphone is in his hand. The woman singing is Aunt Harriet McClintock. The discs are splayed along behind John Lomax on the ground. Ruby Lomax is taking the photograph right now, and she's writing on a dust jacket like that. So she has it in her hand. She's writing down what's going on. That's Ruby's hand. And then she's writing the field note later on to tell us exactly what happened at that moment. It's the very best documentation you'll get for any John Lomax recordings. Ruby. This is Pitt Bell. Alan spent the 1950s in Europe because of some problems with the FBI, and Pitt Bell went with him. She had no particular expertise in field work. She was his girlfriend, but the role that she played on this trip was important because Spain's a very gendered, at least in 1952, very gendered society, and Alan really couldn't get anywhere near any of the women's genres in Spain. He was great with the men's genres, like the pig castrator, no problem. You could talk to him. But Pitt Bell, even though her Spanish wasn't very good, provided entry into a lot of those communities, and also wrote quite eloquently. If you look on some of the online papers, you can find out a lot about what's going on with her. 1955, there's Elizabeth again. There's Anna, about 11 years old, and Alan, trying to be a normal family, but not really. They moved to Italy, right? And Anna and Elizabeth moved to Italy to be with Alan while he was in Italy doing field work, and he would occasionally come and visit them at their seaside villa in Italy. In 1958, he came back to the United States. 1959, he was joined by Shirley Collins, the great singer, Shirley Collins, great English singer, folk revival singer. And again, what do we see? We see Shirley Collins learning from ballad singers, being a warm and gentle person who could assist Alan, who had some challenges along those lines, to really get the very best performances. And Amita Riddle is an amazing example of that. Antoinette Marchand was also married to Alan for a short time. She went with him to the last major field trip to the Caribbean in 1962. And there she is running the gear. Beautiful Naga recorder, huh? All right. We got a couple of those. So this is the story, right? The women who were with them were smart, organized, and provided entry into women's communities and assisted in documentation. For that, I'm quite grateful. I think the archive has benefited tremendously from them. And I would say, well, probably should skip over this a little bit, but this is a later project. Irmgard Bartenia, Faustine Palais were central to the Laban notation, dance notation field, and worked with Alan on the Choreometrics project, a project of comparative dance styles during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And most importantly, we should end with a celebration of the people who were documented and whose voices we can enjoy and listen to in the photographs any day that we want to. So it's good to be at the American Folklife Center. All right. Oops.
Thank you. That was great. I think Betsy's going to come up, and we'll take questions afterwards for Todd, but we wanted to just take the last 10 minutes to take advantage of you all being here to get some feedback on what we're thinking of doing over the next, we're thinking probably 2 years, where we want to highlight women-generated collections, discussions, programming, and we'd like to know what you think. We can start by just saying very briefly that a lot of the Botkin lectures will be highlighting our women-generated collections or women collectors or contemporary women ethnographers. We have just agreed with Wikipedia to do an edit-a-thon for February 8th, midday on February 8th, both here and if we can get our act together, we'll also have people participating from off-site with the idea that we will have 25 or 30 women collectors, ethnomusicologists, folklorists, and dance scholars, people who are now who either don't have Wikipedia entries or have very stub entries, and we will ask people in to help us beef those up, to expand them and enrich them, with the idea that if it's successful, we'll do that more often. And I think we're going to do both contemporary collectors and especially people whose collections are here in the archive. But we haven't, so that we have that set. The Botkin lectures where, as you know, the American Folklife Center does a series of lectures, usually once a month. And we actually need for the federal budget to be passed before we stabilize those and announce them. But we hope that will happen soon. But we are talking to people. But we're always, always interested in other people who we should feature here as speakers, either to talk about their own collecting or to talk about our historic collections. Mm-hmm. And we could also have discussions and symposia. We're thinking of perhaps a year and a half from now, 2 years from now, doing a major conference on women collections and collectors. But we're also thinking of doing some discussions perhaps on ethics and challenges and opportunities of women doing field work, trading stories, trading tips, trading things. But we would also like your ideas. What would you like to see us do?
I'd kind of like to know more about the intersection between anthropology and folklore, especially NYU and Franz Boas and all of the women that he trained.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I would just add on to that also not just anthropology, but the sort of ethnomusicology as a discipline. In that
Mm-hmm.
intersection.
Mm-hmm. There are also a lot of women, I should point out, involved with dance and dance history, and we do have some collections here that I think are underused on dance, and that might be another way to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lisa?
I'm just thinking about Nathan, John, what's his last name? The guy, Salzburg, does these presentations where he comes and he just shows raw footage from the Lomax collection, and he did that, and it was so amazing because a lot of us have, and you all have in your collections, like so much raw footage that nobody ever looks at. And he
That's true.
He didn't really explain or describe stuff. He just kind of put together like a 40-minute presentation of this stuff, and it was fabulous. I wonder, like, to get people interested in the collections, of having some presentations of some just
Throughout
yeah.
the,
recordings,
yeah.
you know, like.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, that's interesting.
What sort of, we've been talking more about historical collections or collections that may be in our archive already. What about contemporary work and contemporary issues? What would you like to see? Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest one, and probably locally one of the most important, would be all of the stuff happening with Go-Go right now in DC and some of that folk life. And some of the contemporary the ethnographers and ethnomusicologists who are working in that,
Mhm.
of which there are many. Natalie Hopkinson comes to mind immediately.
Okay.
There was, Lisa?
This may be a little far afield, but there are a lot of us who are basically performers or coming out of a performer tradition who do, yes, activate the archives, but many other archives and books that are there's a movement going on in the folklore world of rejecting ballads as having a negative attitude about, we look at murder and death and the rape of women and patriarchy, and people are rewriting ballads and giving them positive endings. And there's sort of, it sounds funny, but there are manifestos coming out in a lot of the different folklore societies about these things. And it might be interesting to have some sort of exploration of how, not just beautiful performances of things that are in the archives, but different ways of making use of materials in the archives, for what end and what purpose, and is there a role for the materials as a history as opposed to a form of celebration? It's almost the same kind of thing that's going on with the Confederate statues. Do you think of these as folklore as celebration, or do you think of it as a way of remembering and dealing with the past? And as this is the Library of Congress, this is sort of partly it's celebratory, but partly it's got a museum quality, so it's a place for a serious exploration among artists for commemorating songs that may have present meanings, but also have past meanings that are worthy of remembering.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, that's good.
Actually, I wanted, Candace, some of what Lisa's brought up, a lot of what you do is about working in different formats, and when you were talking about, it's about the content and how you express it can happen in a multitude of ways. Do you see yourself as being unusual? Who are your colleagues and peers? Who do you feel are doing similar work, and how does it relate to this?
No, it's funny. It's the ongoing discussion between me and my colleagues and my friends. They see me as the woman with the machete kind of clearing the brush because I'm the one who never would claim myself as one thing. And it makes it's more complicated because it's harder to market me or figure out what it is I do. But I like that. I think I think if anything, it's like women need to have more permission to not have to be in this box of this is even just as ethnographers. And I think if you try different mediums, it's like you'll see that, it takes some talent, but not extraordinary talent to get, and the technology is so good now. So, I think, I wish I knew more people who did what I do, because sometimes I want somebody as an example of, maybe I should try that, but I'm kind of figuring it out as I go. But I would love to know more. Back to my question earlier today about how many, just in terms of the types of women who do this kind of work, whether they're married, whether they have children, whether they, how many black women are part of your collection, and not only what's in there, but what's not in there, I think, tells a more interesting story. And so where are those holes in our history, in our documentation, to kind of revisit that in the current context of, the political climate that we're in now? I think that would be fascinating. I don't know if you get to do that, because somebody would have to go through your collections and,
Well, actually, I'm
Funny you
sorry.
should mention that. No, go ahead.
Yeah, that brings up, that's a good segue. We can come back to the discussion about a symposium, but another idea that we've just toyed around with and have not really come to any conclusions, but we do offer some fellowships, and those certainly can be purposed for work in the areas that we're talking about, but we've also thought about or toyed with the idea of developing some special opportunities or fellowships, or to bring people in to work in the collections, specifically on, either particular collections. I don't know. John, do you want to?
Looking at some of those themes,
Yeah.
It's in our collections already.
Yeah. But we would love to have people do that. Part of what we're interested in doing as part of this and some of the other work we do is just how to open up our archives, how to get people in and using this material, and primary source material, how do you make it come alive now?
And raising visibility for the people
Yeah.
who do some of the work that maybe gets subsumed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a brilliant idea. And I mean, even to have somebody from the present who's doing this kind of work comment on that and contextualize that. You know, it's not that we're just trying to bring up the past or show,
Right.
you know, where we've fallen short or whatever, but it's like, you know, reframing that discussion about, well, why and what was lost, but what we can learn from that, and where it's happening right now. I mean, we're so far from where we need to be right now too. So I think, finding somebody to go through that, I think it's brilliant to put resources towards that, 'cause it only helps.
We're perhaps several short-term fellowships for someone to come, even for a week, to have a scholar come for a week and just really go through a collection thoroughly and write an article on it, or give a paper on it, or do a podcast on it, just to raise the visibility of that collection.
There's Lisa, and then, I'm sorry, your name, Lisa?
Well, I was thinking about the gaps, which I've been thinking about a lot since I heard that you were going to do the symposium. And I mean, I'm imagining, I know there's not a lot of material by African American collectors in the collections, but I imagine that across the country there's a lot of Black churches and small historical societies where Black people have been documenting things and saving and archiving. And I'm wondering whether, like, one project in terms of filling in the gaps is identifying where some of that material is, and not appropriating it, but making it visible.
Pointing to it, yeah.
And also our Hispanic holdings could be enriched greatly. There's a number of you can't have everything in the archive, but we'd like to get a better, more balanced reflection of America in our archive. So we really are trying for that. Yes, Lisa.
Speaking of visibility, street art, yard art, I think women, certainly yarn bombing has become a very popular thing among women.
I know people who actually do that.
In my neighborhood.
Maybe just a few more questions, because we're almost out of time. Anne?
Well, I could just comment on a few different things that I've been hearing. I mean, I loved what Meredith had to say about intergenerational conversations, conversations across generations of women. And in terms of incorporating performers, I think maybe it was something that Steve did on one of the blogs, but when you had the Lomax 100th, and I was like in a faraway land, but I remember you had these concerts of people who had, contemporary performers
Doing Lomax,
who learned Lomax repertoire, and then you could like look at the concert, and then you could click, and then all of a sudden you could click again, and then you were looking at Lomax's real papers, those very typed up things that Todd just showed us. I mean, that to me was really exciting. And then the third thing I'll say is that it's really inspiring to see these, public independent scholars. And I know that, when I was president of SEM, I mean, just the mournful cry from graduate students saying, like, we need alt-ac careers, and we developed all of these workshops and so forth. But, I think, what you're doing and what, who else? Somebody I was just talking to. Independent scholar, Berkeley.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, right here in front of me. Just so inspirational. You don't have to be a professor, right?
Exactly,
To do research and to love music, but just how to be successful at it, and to maybe provide, more just more visibility.
Yeah.
So I think actually permeating the academic societies in terms of workshops and things like that, there's enough time.
And I think there's interest among academic societies. We just recently hosted the SEM is a Society for Ethnomusicology, and they just had a meeting here of a number of professors to figure out how to become more public sector oriented. The very term that the term alt-ac for alternative academic,
alternative
to academia is prioritizes academia to begin with. So some of us in public sector don't even like alt-ac.
And Nancy, the irony of that meeting that I sort of bombed is that 2 weeks later there's a note. Okay, now we're going to do an edited volume.
Yeah.
right? So let's just reproduce
I did
ourselves
notice
from
that.
here,
That was from
right?
outside, yeah.
Wait a minute, I thought we were trying to,
Get out
find a
of
way
that.
Yeah.
out of this morass.
I think we're on the same page about this one. I would love to continue. We were actually, though,
Just one quick
yeah,
point
yeah,
I'd like to
sure.
make that I think is interesting is to talk about content and what we were talking about earlier, and in terms of what ethnographers today do with their content and how they protect their work and how they protect the subjects and the people that they're in contact with. Because increasingly, in the world of Getty and people who just want to gobble up your work and take it, even or ask you to give it away, ways to teaching ethnographers today what kind of NDAs they need, what kind of consent forms they need to protect themselves in the work. Because otherwise, I mean, you just, like I said, I'm figuring a lot of this stuff out, and I've done work for 20 years, but that's the question that I think people don't even know to ask when they're starting this work. And then you're just faced with this opportunity, and you're like, oh, I want to do it, and then you realize you've given away, and you've let somebody exploit the people that trusted you. And so I think that's something that.
So just very pragmatic, some very pragmatic programming.
Yeah, it's kind of a new world problem.
Yeah, it is
Yeah,
a new world problem.
and on the web, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Okay, one more question.
Quick thing, I was thinking about how nice it was to be able to share some of the things that I had found in these collections that I just got the sense that very few people knew about. And I'm wondering about maybe some kind of like mixtape initiative, where you could put people who had experience in an archive could kind of flag things to say, maybe this could go out as, online, or, just make it, put things out there so that people can, so that they're not, I just feel like there's this sense that things are hidden if they're not, especially if they don't have a name that people are familiar with, like Lomax or something like that. So.
Okay, good point. I think we should perhaps, we could probably go for hours here, but why don't we continue over wine and cheese outside? I want to thank everybody for coming. I especially want to thank the speakers. I thought really it was a phenomenal day of wonderful presentations. So can we have a round of applause for everybody involved?